According to the Russian Federal Codex, propaganda aimed at forming non-traditional sexual orientations, if these actions are not punishable under criminal law, will be subject to administrative fines.
Russia, which is sadly the country I come from, has a law, the so-called gay propaganda law, according to which if you publicly say that being queer is good or normal, you can be fined. This law has been around since 2013, but it's important to talk about it now because first of all, it just got expanded and became a lot worse. And secondly, because the Kremlin is trying to reframe the war in Ukraine as basically a war against queerness. Here's what the TV pundits are saying.
ЛГБТ-войска.
Русских людей приходят оккупировать геи.
Here's a politician, a Duma deputy.
ЛГБТ сегодня это инструмент гибридной войны.
And here's the supreme commander.
Разве мы хотим, чтобы в наших школах с начальных классов детям навязывали извращения, которые ведут к деградации и вымиранию, и предлагали сделать операцию по смене пола?
What you need to understand is that he's talking about gender confirmation surgeries in a speech announcing the would-be annexation, of Ukrainian territories. Here's my executive summary of his entire 40-minute speech. We must attack Ukraine to protect heterosexuality. By the way, a lot of the language you're going to hear in this video is inaccurate or offensive because I wanted to give you a realistic idea of what's going on in Russian media. This rhetoric sounds deranged, it sounds absolutely bonkers, but it's not coming out of nowhere. Almost since the start of his reign, Putin has been building his empire on 3 pillars: a revival of the Orthodox Church, which obviously brings homophobia with it, returning Russia to its imperial past, which means regressive politics, and positioning Russia as a country that is in spiritual and cultural opposition to the West, especially the West's horrible progressivism. So being anti-queer is kind of the link between every sentiment or value group that Putin has been trying to impose on Russians for over 2 decades now. I'm convinced that Putin has no personal feelings about queer people, whether positive or negative. And in 2001, when he still cared about the West liking him, these hot little queer baiters were making out on stage in the Kremlin itself. And Putin certainly has nothing against homoeroticism. But promoting hatred of queer people serves his interests, so he does it. This video is about the way governments, well, one specific government, uses vulnerable groups as a kind of political red herring, why the Kremlin chose to use queer people this way, and what all of this means for queer people in Russia. So none of us die of sadness while watching this video. I'm going to be including a couple little interludes featuring flourishing queer people in Russia and Eastern Europe. Now, back to the bad stuff. Part 1, hatred. The fact that a gay propaganda law. Okay, I'm gonna stop doing this every time I say gay propaganda and every time I say the West. Just assume that it's in quotes. The fact that a gay propaganda law is discriminatory is obvious, but I think it's worth looking at this law more closely because the way it's worded actually makes it more poisonous than it already seems. We're gonna look at the 2013 version because the 2022 version, its official text isn't available yet online. What we do know about the amended law is that now propaganda can be demonstrated to anybody, whereas before it was just to minors, and that the fines for doing this have been increased by a lot. So the official name of the first version of this law, the 2013 version, is the Russian Federal Law for the purpose of protecting children from information advocating a denial of traditional family values. I personally have some questions. What are traditional family values? Is divorce traditional? I've watched a lot of Russian politicians and pundits talking about these mysterious values.
Традиционные ценности.
Традиционные ценности.
Традиционные ценности.
Традиционные семейные ценности.
The one thing I've been able to understand about them, the closest thing to a definition, is that they're not gay. That's pretty much how they're defined. Non-traditional is gay, traditional is heterosexual. What kind of information counts as advocating against these values? That information is the famous gay propaganda, and its official definition is very, very long and vague, which is typical of Russian censorship laws, because if you don't define the forbidden clearly, then more people will just keep completely quiet just in case. But Deputy Alexander Hinstein provided a succinct summary as quoted by CNN. I would like to add that this summary is completely unironic. Our bill is not an act of censorship. We are only saying that propaganda, that is positive promotion, praise, saying that this is normal and maybe even better than traditional relations, should be banned. Moving on, why do children need to be protected from disinformation? First of all, I mean, this should be obvious, but this law is not about protecting children. But saying that this law is about protecting children evokes the whole all gay people are predators trope. Maybe you even haven't heard of that trope, but Russian TV is very into it. Here's the other thing. The way this law is worded, it implies that children being witnessed, being exposed to homosexuality, to queerness, will somehow change them. Like you can get it from being next to it, like a disease. And what do we feel instinctively towards disease? Fear and disgust. Point is, this law is not what it pretends to be. Trying to censor the LGBTQ community out of existence is already bad enough, but this is not a censorship law. It is a law intended to incite hatred. After the first version of this law went into effect in 2013, there was a massive spike in hate crimes against queer people. Just to give you a reference point of what Russian homophobia is like, here's what happened in 2016 when two YouTubers decided to do an experiment and walk around Moscow holding hands. Part 2. The War, Ukraine, and the Gay West. The Russian government creates these laws to stoke homophobia. The next step is to weaponize this homophobia in their own interests. The first gay propaganda law came out in 2013, and in 2014, Russia attacked Ukraine and annexed Crimea. Now it's 2022, Russia's doing a full-blown invasion of Ukraine, and they're expanding the gay propaganda law. It's like there's a rule or something. When we're with neighboring democracies, we persecute queer people at home. Now, inciting hatred towards a domestic minority to distract from failures in foreign politics is dictatorship 101. It's Putin. But trying to justify a brutal war of the kind Europe hasn't seen since World War II with a strategy that is basically, oh no, the gays, is a stretch, even for Russian politicians. And yet that's exactly what they're doing.
Специальная военная операция происходит не только на полях сражений, но и в сознаниях, и в умах, и в душах людей, потому что Россия является форпостом защиты и сохранения традиционных ценностей в противовес новым псевдоценностям, навязываемым Западом, и в первую очередь сексуальных девиаций как норму.
Why did they choose this bananas rhetoric? The problem is Putin needs a really big emotion-based justification for attacking Ukraine. He needs to create a grand existential enemy that outweighs the evil of his invasion. Earlier in the year, that enemy was schmatzis. I'm trying to do the TikTok thing where you just change the censored word. I don't know, it sounds stupid, but what are you going to do? So the pundits were focusing on what they called the de-schmatzification of Ukraine.
Задача, напоминаю, спецоперации, денацификация и демилитаризация Украины.
They must have realized that people are aware that Ukraine has, in fact, a Jewish president, and that Ukraine's schmatzi problem isn't any worse than Russia's schmatzi problem or the US's schmatzi problem. So all the pundits and ideologues have changed direction like a little school of fish and are now saying that this is a war against the West and specifically against the West's tolerance of queer people. Are schmatzis and queer people essentially being equated in this horrible line of thought? Yeah. Now, saying that Russia is pitted against the West in this war is kind of true because the West is imposing sanctions on Russia and supplying Ukraine with weapons. The absurd part is, first of all, saying that this war was started by the West. It was not, and that queer people have anything to do with it. Here's how Russian ideologues try to turn "we invaded Ukraine" into "we're protecting Russians from queer people." The basics are, Russia is special and different, which is why the West envies it.
Им просто не дает покоя, что в мире есть такая великая, огромная страна с народом, который не умеет и никогда не будет жить по чужой указке.
I do wonder if Putin recognizes the irony of saying that Russia is getting picked on because it is different. Secondly, the West wants to make Russia follow its rules.
Собственно, и до последнего времени не прекращались попытки использовать нас в своих интересах. Разрушить наши традиционные ценности и навязать нам свои псевдоценности.
And we can't accept Western values because they are horrible and rotten. And the proof of this rottenness are queer people.
Разве мы хотим, чтобы у нас здесь, в нашей стране, в России, вместо мамы и папы был родитель номер 1, номер 2, номер 3? Совсем спятили уже.
Normally, the pundits don't go into detail about why exactly being queer is bad. They just kind of treat it as a given. But if they do want to justify their opinions, they say, first of all, that it's sinful, and second of all, that it harms reproduction.
И мы воюем с сатанизмом.
Просто, понимаете, еще 50-100 лет никто не будет рожать, никто уже не сможет рожать.
If the Kremlin successfully sells the war against the gay West angle, they will distract Russians from Russia's failures in this war, justify the failures in this war, because if Russia's fighting the entire, what they call the collective West, rather than just Ukraine, that explains why it's doing so terribly. Manufacture an enemy that is easy to demonize in the eyes of homophobic Russians, and bonus points highlight the political divides within the United States and the European Union around queer issues, and maybe even deepen those divides, which will make Russia seem relatively stronger. Part 3. Is any of it working? In summary, the Russian government began a heinous war and are now insisting, somewhat retroactively, that this war was actually motivated ideologically and are trying to whip up some enthusiasm for this ideology. The problem is the ideology is shoddy and inconsistent. It's a house of cards that Russians don't want to live in. For example, orthodoxy. Despite Putin's best efforts, Russia is still super secular. According to pollsters, Russians tend to say they're Christian, but only 14% of them go to church even once a month. So when Putin is calling queer rights supporters false prophets,
В Нагорной проповеди Иисус Христос, обличая лжепророков, говорит: «По плодам их узнаете их».
or when the pundits invoke Satanism, I don't really know who they're talking to. It sounds like they're yelling in an empty room. And when it comes to tradition, Putin equates tradition with heterosexuality, but he must have his own version of history, because if you look at actual Russian history, in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, Russia was incredibly liberal towards homosexuality, much more so than Western Europe. We know this because European emissaries that visited Russia at the time would write these reports. For example, the English poet George Turberville, who visited Moscow in 1568, noted in his poems describing the places and manners of the country and people of Russia that, although muzhik, man, has a decent spouse, he prefers his sodomite friend to her. And in terms of being anti-West, the traditional values that Russians are supposed to be so invested in are presented as an either-or. Either you get Russian traditional values or you get the West. The problem is it's completely unclear what these traditional values offer Russians other than the glory of heterosexuality. Meanwhile, the quote-unquote West offers the internet, technology, pop culture. The best way I can describe the general vibe towards the West in Russia is this. So when I was little, sometimes, kids, even adults like my school teachers would go on these little anti-American rants, being like, oh, Americans, they're so fat and stupid with their hamburgers. And I would say, well, I'm American. And immediately, their jaws would drop and they'd say, but why are you here then? If you could be in America right now, why are you here? At one point, Putin said that you can't foist values onto people.
Поэтому традиционные ценности нельзя никому навязать.
And it turns out he's completely right. Because this Russo-Orthodox traditionalist world he keeps talking about, it doesn't really exist in reality, at least not to the extent that he'd like it to. Despite the propaganda that has just been spouting from every orifice of Russian authorities, Russian support for the war in Ukraine is falling. In the last 6 months, the number of people pro-negotiations with Ukraine has doubled, while the number of people supporting the war has been halved. But what's heartbreaking is that the one part of his entire ideology that is really sticking is homophobia, is hatred of queer people. I guess hatred is stickier than religion. However, I don't know how hopeful this message is, because this is my personal opinion and this is conjecture. I do not think that the efforts of the Russian government to stoke homophobia will ever overpower the wave of progressive attitudes that are currently accessible to anybody with a Wi-Fi connection. When I was growing up in Russia, I did not know a single person who was out. And that video from 2016 that I showed you earlier is absolutely horrifying. But the last time I was in Moscow, which was 2021, I was absolutely astounded in the best way possible at the number of queer presenting people I saw just in the streets. Lots of gay couples holding hands, lots of people who presented as non-binary or trans. So in conclusion, all of my respect to the queer culture in Russia that is thriving no matter what. And here's a taste of it for you. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos from me, please subscribe and please consider supporting me on Patreon. If you support me on Patreon, first of all, you get your name in the credits of every video. And please share your thoughts and comments about the videos or other topics with me. I read and respond to everything I get on Patreon. See you soon.